Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Tonight, a closer look at the direction Russia is taking. Vladimir Putin has been speaking more openly about ethnic Russian identity as the foundation of the state, a shift that is being noticed not only inside Russia, but across the former Soviet region. At the same time, the country's economy is increasingly tied to its neighbors as sanctions push trade through alternative routes. To examine the contrast between a more nationalist tone at home and a growing reliance on partners abroad and what that tells us about Russia's current position, let's take a look at our latest report.
As Russia enters the fifth year of its full-scale war against Ukraine, Vladimir Putin is increasingly relying on a narrow vision of Russian ethno-nationalism to sustain domestic support. This strategy may consolidate backing among ethnic Russians, but it carries growing costs, both inside Russia and across the former Soviet space. Within Russia, the Kremlin's emphasis on a Russian ethnic core has deepened alienation among non-Russian communities. Repression and censorship have reduced the visibility of dissent, but not the underlying grievances. Moscow's political messaging increasingly sidelines the multi-ethnic character of the Russian Federation, even as non-Russian regions continue to bear a disproportionate share of economic strain and military losses. Abroad, the effect is clearer. Russia's war against Ukraine and its coercive posture towards neighboring states have accelerated efforts across the region to distance themselves from Moscow. Former Soviet republics that once balanced between Russia and the West are reassessing that relationship, viewing the Kremlin less as a guarantor of stability and more as a source of risk. This ideological narrowing also contrasts with Russia's economic reality. As sanctions bite, Moscow has become more dependent on trade routed through neighboring states, particularly re-exports. While political influence is declining, economic resilience on the same post-Soviet space is quietly increasing, creating an asymmetry. The war has also sharpened the contrast with Ukraine. As Russia leans into exclusionary nationalism, Ukraine's wartime identity has moved in the opposite direction. Religious institutions, for example, have taken on expanded roles as humanitarian hubs, with reported rising participation reflecting a broader search for social solidarity while under Russian attack.
And now we're zooming in on the East-splaining portion of our show. The Kremlin's current policy towards ethnic minorities marks a decisive shift away from the post-Soviet balancing act Moscow long tried to maintain. Adopted in November 2025, Vladimir Putin's national policy strategy formally placed ethnic Russians at the center of state identity. Set to last until 2036, the strategy labels ethnic Russians as the state-forming nation, while all other groups are expected to fit themselves into that framework.
Officially, the strategy aims to build a unified multi-ethnic Russian nation. In practice, that unity is defined almost entirely through ethnic Russian language, culture, and historical memory. Non-Russian minorities are placed under pressure to identify as civic Russians on these terms, a move many see as stripping their identities of political substance and relegating them to folklore rather than living institutions. The shift is also material. At least half of state funding for nationality policy is now directed toward ethnic Russian cultural needs, reversing decades of focus on managing minority regions. This strategy also explicitly seeks to extend Russian identity to Crimea, the Donbass, and other occupied regions of Ukraine. Security logic also underpins the entire national strategy document. Alleged attacks on Russian history and language are framed as major threats, justifying tighter policies both at home and towards neighboring states accused of fostering such views.
And now we're zooming in on Moscow to take a look at the issue in greater detail. Vladimir Putin is placing growing emphasis on Russian national identity, framing the state more clearly around ethnic Russian history, culture, and destiny. In recent years, and particularly since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin's language has shifted. The idea of Russia as a multi-ethnic federation remains in the constitution, but official rhetoric increasingly centers on the Russian people as the core of the state. Supporters present this as unity in wartime. Critics, however, see it as a narrowing of identity that risks marginalizing others. Russia is home to dozens of ethnic groups, from the North Caucasus to Siberia. In some of those regions, mobilization for the war has been felt more heavily, and there is quiet concern that a stronger ethno-nationalist tone could deepen the existing tensions. Beyond Russia's borders, the message is also being heard. Countries across Central Asia and the South Caucasus, many with large Russian-speaking minorities, are wary of rhetoric that appears to elevate one ethnicity above others in what was once a shared Soviet space. Yet there is another dimension to this story. While the political language has grown more assertive, Russia's economy has become increasingly reliant on its neighbors. Western sanctions have redirected trade routes, and goods now reach Russia indirectly through former Soviet states. These countries have become important intermediaries, handling re-exports of technology and consumer products. That creates a striking contrast. Moscow is promoting a more ethnically defined vision of the nation, while depending economically on cooperation with non-Russian partners. How that balance holds may prove significant, not only for Russia's internal cohesion, but for its relationships across the region in the years ahead. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
Now, in your recent article, you said that ideology is slowly creeping into Moscow's war narratives, that before that, Moscow tried not to rely on it too much, but it is changing. Can you tell us more about it, and also what kind of impact does it make on Putin's war plans?
Well, the biggest problem is that Putin has tried to run this war essentially with mercenaries, that he's tried to recruit the number of soldiers and officers he needs, not because they believe in the war, but because they're getting paid, and paid extremely well. The bonuses that are offered to Russian soldiers who agree to serve in the military and fight in Ukraine, they're very much larger than any way that most of them could, any amount of money that most could earn. I think the reason he chose to do that is not only that he, like many politicians in the world today, he seems to believe that money is the primary mover for anything anyone does. It certainly is important to him, but also because once you announce an ideology, you are constrained. If you articulate a particular point of view, there are things that you can't easily do. If you are take a left-wing position, you can't form alliances with right-wingers, and so on and so forth. And I think Putin was concerned that if he tried to create a new ideological system, he would find himself constrained by those in the Russian political system who actually would come to believe it. Now, however, he's being forced to change directions in that regard because he's running out of money. The country is in real trouble economically, and his ability to extract enough money and make sure that he can continue to pay these bonuses and to take care of the military that way isn't as easy as it was. And so he's introducing ideological elements, possibly remembering his own younger years in Soviet times, but also as a way to try to keep fighting on the cheap, as it were, by getting people to go and fight for his vision of Russia rather than for money. It may be an effective strategy in the short term, but in the longer term, it's very dangerous because, as I say, ideologies not only motivate, but they also constrain. And I don't think Putin wants to be constrained in any way.
And yet he seems to be walking exactly into this trap, because the ideology that Russia is relying upon is mostly focused on this sort of ethnic nationalism. I mean, obviously it does have traces of, the references to former Soviet glory, but it is mostly based on this concept that, Russians are there to dominate. They are the most vital force within the Russian Federation. So the problem with that, as you're saying, is that, while ethnic Russians will obviously embrace it, everyone else is going to be alienated by this. What implications does it have within Russia itself and beyond?
Well, Mr. Putin has made a mistake that few of his predecessors in Soviet times or the Tsarist Empire did. He's decided to try to make himself the chief spokesman of the dominant ethnic group, the ethnic Russians, and that has led him to make statements and his supporters to make statements that are offending and alienating non-Russians within the country and detracting from his ability to gain supporters abroad. Obviously, many people may be in favor of a leftist or rightist political strategy, but they're not necessarily going to sign up to be loyal to an ethnic nationalism, which is what is now on offer. The problem is even greater, though, than that. The percentage of ethnic Russians in the Russian Federation is falling precipitously. Putin still claims that 80% of the population of the Russian Federation is ethnic Russian. In fact, the real number is certainly down at 70% or even lower, and it's going to head further. A recent survey found that while among Muslim nationalities of the Russian Federation, expected family size was still 4 or 5 children, in the Russian Federation, it's down around 1 or even lower in the big cities. And what that means is that over the next 10 to 20 years, the share of ethnic Russians will fall back to close what it was in 1991 in the USSR.
So a quick question at this point. What kind of identity could be proposed as an alternative? Because one could say, well, the Soviet Union was kind of more flexible because it was, by definition, multinational. But the Russian Federation, even the name implies it is Russian. Yet, as you're saying, the number of ethnic Russians is falling. So is Putin hoping that people will identify as Russian not by way of ethnicity, but by way of this sort of shared concept of the Russian world, the so-called Ruski Mir? Is that what he's actually aiming for?
Well, no, he would like everyone to identify as an ethnic Russian, using the Russian word Ruski. But in fact, that has grown out of a policy which made much more sense in the 90s and the first decade of Putin's rule, which was to get people to identify as civic Russians, to make the point that, yes, you can be a Tatar, you can be a Mari, you can be a Mordvin, but you are also a civic Russian. Unfortunately, in recent years, he's fallen into the trap which other dictators have fallen in trying to run imperial states, and he's now acting as if these people should all become Russian in the Ruski ethnic sense. I've written and I've certainly believed that Mr. Putin is not recreating the Soviet Union. He's rather recreating the conditions which led to the demise of the Soviet Union. We're moving in a direction of the ethnic Russians forming an ever smaller percentage of the population. And at the same time, we've got a leadership that seems to believe that it can make everyone an ethnic Russian just by declaring it. That's not working. Moreover, it's worth remembering that in the last census, more than 10 million people who are now counted as Russians didn't identify a nationality at all. So that it's not clear that the ethnic Russian component is nearly as solid as many people would like to think. We all talk about divisions within Ukrainians, within Armenians, within Uzbeks, but we're less likely to talk about divisions within the ethnic Russian community, and yet they're very, very real. Russians who live in Vladivostok and Russians who live in Kaliningrad are very different people, and they have much less in common than most people assume, certainly much less than Vladimir Putin does. He has reduced ethnic Russian nationalism in many ways to the speaking of Russian, but that doesn't work. And people should remember that empires are usually dismantled by people who speak the language of the empire, but who object to being mistreated because they're not fully accepted. It was, after all, an English-trained lawyer named Gandhi who brought down British rule in India, not Hindi-speaking peasants from Benares. And the same thing, I think, will be true now in the next wave of the decolonization of Russia.
That's a crucial question, isn't it? Because you've mentioned that we're not likely to see this sort of parade of sovereignties that Russia or the Soviet Union experienced back in the 90s. If not, then what is going to happen? What is going to happen in these distant provinces where people actually start perhaps rediscovering their identity? How far will they be prepared to go?
Well, it's not going to look like 1991, where there were constitutional arrangements for the exits of republics, and where under Mikhail Gorbachev there were real elections in the regions and republics long before there was any real election in the Russian capital. So I think we're going to probably look at a imperial decay that's going to look a lot more like 1918, where you're going to see a lot of chaos. You're going to probably see a great deal of violence. But this is being exacerbated by Vladimir Putin's short-term goals, which have long-term and very negative consequences for his country. I'm not predicting this is going to happen next week or next year, but I'm saying that if you try to mobilize the country on the basis of an ethnic majority that is decreasing in size, over time, the others will find ways to resist and to try to promote their own interest. That's happening. One thing that's happened already is Vladimir Putin has created a financial system where the center takes almost all the taxes from the regions and then returns only a small part, forcing the regions to struggle to find money to pay what they have to pay because they have to carry out the center's orders. I think perhaps the most important piece of data we've received in the last few weeks is the report in the central media that Russian governors, that's the people who are running the oblasts, krais, and republics in the Russian Federation, have nearly doubled their spending on bodyguards since the beginning of Putin's expanded war in Ukraine. They're worried about their physical well-being because there is pressure from below. And if the center weakens, at least some of them are likely to flip and no longer be supporters of whatever the Kremlin says, but rather try to get in front of their own populations to save their own lives and perhaps give them a political boost. That's something that hasn't happened before, and we're going to see a very different Russian politics in the future as a result.
And a very quick question right now, because we're running out of time, but it seems like the Russian leadership doesn't really understand this. Recently, Putin's chief ideologue, Alexander Dugin, outlined plans for Russia taking over Central Asia, taking over Azerbaijan, Armenia, all the countries that used to be a part of the Soviet Union. Does it mean that they don't understand these processes?
Dugin certainly doesn't understand. Every advance that the Russian army makes into non-Russian territory further dilutes the percentage of ethnic Russians in the population under Moscow's control. And that means that the point at which there will be an explosive situation in which it will entirely collapse will come all that much sooner. Dugin is going to be remembered as someone who unintentionally was the gravedigger of the Russian state.
So there is a discrepancy between reality and ideological pronouncements there. Paul Goebel was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Ukraine is moving some of its electrical substations underground as part of a long-term effort to protect critical infrastructure from Russian strikes. So far, one substation has been secured inside an underground concrete bunker, with work on a second already underway.
The initiative aims to shield key nodes of the power grid from missile and drone attacks that have repeatedly disrupted electricity supply across the country. The effort, however, is costly and slow-moving. Each underground substation costs tens of millions of dollars, and Ukraine cannot independently finance protection for nearly 100 critical substations nationwide. Energy experts say the project will likely take several years and require substantial external funding. Russian attacks have heavily damaged power generation facilities in central, southern, and eastern Ukraine, increasing reliance on plants in the west. Without functioning substations, electricity cannot be transmitted to vulnerable regions, making them a prime target.
Japan is expected to join a NATO-led program that funds the purchase of US weapons for Ukraine, according to Japanese media citing NATO officials. The initiative, known as PURKL, allows NATO members and partner countries to finance high-priority military equipment for Kiev.
According to reports, any Japanese contribution through the program would be limited to non-lethal aid, in line with constitutional restrictions on providing lethal military assistance. A representative of Japan's embassy in Ukraine said Tokyo was aware of the reports but denied that Japan had formally joined the initiative, saying that no common policy with NATO has been established yet. Despite legal constraints, Japan remains one of Ukraine's staunchest supporters. To date, Japan has provided Ukraine about $15 billion in aid and pledged an additional $3.5 billion, mostly in financial and humanitarian assistance.
Ukraine's coordination headquarters for the treatment of prisoners of war said on Tuesday that Moscow is pushing a new way to access Starlink satellite internet. Russian forces are now reportedly threatening the families of Ukrainian prisoners of war to register Starlink satellite terminals in their names for use by the Russian military.
According to Ukrainian officials, the pressure campaign began after Ukraine's defense ministry, working with Starlink's owner SpaceX, succeeded in disabling illegally used Starlink terminals that Russian units had relied on for battlefield communications. Unable to restore access, Russian forces have turned to relatives of Ukrainian prisoners of war. Ukrainian officials said that these families were threatened or blackmailed into registering Starlink terminals in their own names. In turn, Ukraine warns that the equipment would be used in attacks on its territory by Russia.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.